In this video, we will explore the use of voids within the Volante POS system. We will discuss a comparison between voids and refunds, as well as the best practices for using voids during the same business day. Voids are corrections that we're making to a transaction that's taken place during that business day, but before we pull our final transaction numbers and reporting. They're used to correct a mistake that may have been made in a transaction. For example, incorrect items may have been entered or an incorrect payment type may have been applied. We also use voids to make corrections for customer satisfaction reasons. If a customer comes to complain about the transaction, we may choose to void it and return the money back to the customer, either through cash, credit, or in some cases directly to the customer's account if they're part of our customer database. We can also use discounts or refunds for the customer satisfaction purposes on days outside of the current business day. For example, if a customer comes back about a transaction that took place 2 days ago, we would not apply a void in that circumstance. Instead, we would issue a refund to the customer or provide them with a guest voucher for a future purchase. There are a few things to note about void transactions. Once we've completed a closed day, we can no longer cancel or void a transaction. These transactions are locked down in the system and can no longer be changed. Even if a closed day has not been completed, we may still choose to do a refund or a voucher for the customer depending on the situation. If we're using any sort of customer database exporting for things like payroll deduct or resident billing purposes, please let Volante know so that all of your voids and your refunds and account credits are configured correctly to export to these files. Generally, we're only going to be using voids on the same business day that the transaction has taken place, and we're going to perform our voids before we do our final end of day reports. If we void sales that have taken place on a previous day, this means that the numbers for that day will change. This will impact our reporting and our media balancing. This will also impact the deposit reports for those days if cash is involved. We most often will be using our voids for correction purposes, again, for items that were incorrectly used, items that a customer may have a complaint about, or an incorrect payment was applied. So a void generally means that something has happened in a transaction that shouldn't have been, or that a customer has a complaint about. When we perform a void, it means that the sale will not show on the customer's account if we're using the customer database. Basically, it allows us to change the original receipt, make our corrections, and set it back to 0 or with an adjusted balance. This will make the original receipt balance of 0 in the case of voiding out the entire transaction, as if this transaction never took place. By voiding items, the Volante system will report as if the item was never sold. So your inventory counts will not include the actual usage of items if you did actually generate or create this food item. For proper usage reporting, it would be best to use refund partial instead, as this will not return the item back to inventory. The void reasons that are selected at the time of voiding the item can be configured in the system to put in any void reasons that you wish to track. All of these reasons will appear in our void reason reporting that we will look at later on. Some of the disadvantages of using voids are that voids really should only be done on the same business day to avoid any incorrect data in reporting from previous days. By voiding an item, it does put the item back to inventory, which will lower your net quantity of items sold if you're tracking this. It is much harder to find the transaction if the customer does not have their receipt or if the transaction was not linked to a customer through the customer database. If the transaction is in the customer database, you'll need to look up the original transaction by customer in order to access and make changes to it. Also, you do need to make sure to correct the payment method as part of the finalizing of the void. If you do not correct the payment method, the POS will treat it as cash back, and this can make your deposit report or cash reports incorrect. Voids do show up in a number of different reports, including our media reports, sales reports, as well as specific void and void detail reporting. Voids will appear after the gross, so items entered into the Volante system, and this is unrelated to taxes. So for example, if your gross is $20 and you void $10 of it, the remaining net sales will still be $10. A void can never make your report go into a negative because there must be an original sale to void. As well, a void is recorded not on the day the void is performed, but instead is recorded on the transaction date that the original sale is created. This is why it's important to do voids on the current business day and not for previous days, as it will impact the reporting. Let's take a look now at the POS and how we can void different transactions for different media types. From the POS, we'll take a look at a few ways to modify or void previous transactions that were run during our current business day. I'll go into the user screen and enter my user ID or swipe in my card. Next, we'll go to the View Shift Transaction button, which will take us to our transaction filter checker. We have a few different options from this screen that we can go through. Today's transactions would be all of today's business day transactions, but we can search from previous days if our policies allow us to void on days other than today. I can also sort by employee. I can view Own, which are all of the transactions I have run on any terminal in the organization. I can view by employee to see transactions that were run by a specific employee, or I can view all. And this will show me all transactions run on all terminals throughout today. I can also search by a table trans ID or trans ID if I have a receipt in hand, or I can search by customer if a customer has come back with a complaint about a transaction that was run either to their on account or their meal plan within their customer database. In this case, I'll leave it on View All and say OK to search for transactions for today. The system will search through the entire back office for all transactions and display my results on the right-hand side. I can change my filter views by clicking on the column names to sort by server, by name, by my close time, or my totals. In this case, I'll leave it on my close time, and we can take a look at a few different transactions that were run for today and how we can void them. This first transaction we're looking at today is a cash transaction. I wish to void the entire transaction and return payment back as cash. I'll go ahead at this point and choose to void the order, which will remove all items as well as return in cash. I'm presented with a void reason at this time, so I'll go ahead and pick a reason code and continue with my void. A receipt does print from the receipt printer, and we can see a void has taken place. My totals are now 0, all items are removed, and some information has been logged about what took place in this transaction. For our next transaction, let's take a look at another cash transaction. We can see a few different items were purchased here, but I would like to refund cash for only some of these items. I'm going to go ahead and void partial on this particular transaction by choosing to do a reopen and choosing to modify the table. I can see my items over here on the right. So for example, maybe we've incorrectly billed this alcohol. I'll go ahead and select on this item and choose to do a void. I am presented with my void reason list again, so we'll go ahead and choose associate error. As we can see, change is owing at this time. I'll hit total, and I'm going to go into my payment screen to make payment corrections. As we can see, change is due back of $12.75. I know I'm going to return this back as cash, so I'm going to go ahead and hit done and exit, which exits the transaction and refunds the amount back as cash, $12.75. This is how I can handle a refund of a partial transaction by voiding out one item and returning back as cash, which was my original tender type. Let's take a look at doing a void on a Visa type transaction. This would be the same for any credit card transaction, and we can only void out transactions for credit types that were done during the same business day. The batch from your credit provider will close likely overnight, locking down any transactions regardless of the Volante POS running a closed day. This means that these transactions can no longer be modified even if your day is still open. I'm going to choose to void the order and void this one completely. So we'll choose void order. I'm going to choose a reason, in this case, customer complaint, and the entire transaction will be voided. I do have a notice on screen that the transaction has been voided should I reverse this payment to the credit card of $16.90. I can say yes to this, and I am prompted a second time to void the sale. So I'll say yes a second time. And it does automatically process without the need for the customer to be present. This is because the batch has not been finalized for the day. If, on the other hand, I'm looking at a transaction that I'd like to partially void, maybe I've incorrectly charged a food item, or in this case, a wine, and I'd like to return that back to my customer. This becomes a little bit more complicated to modify and void the items in this transaction, as I will need to have my customer present with card in hand. I'm going to go ahead and choose to reopen this transaction and modify table, and I'm going to remove the alcohol from this transaction. I can go ahead and choose to do a void of the item for any of my void reasons and hit total, and I'm going to go into payment. At this time, change is owing of $3. If I choose done and exit from this screen, it will refund this amount back as cash. This is a default, and we do need to modify our credit transaction at this time. I'm going to go into my CC options button, and I'm going to choose void CC transaction. I'm going to return the entire amount back to the card, and then I'm going to reswipe it as a new amount. I'm going to choose yes. At this time now, I have $11.90 owing. I'm going to go ahead and choose my credit card again and swipe it on the terminal so we can complete payment on this transaction. So in this scenario, we have voided out the transaction to the original credit card and processed a new charge of $11.90 back to the same credit card. I'll choose done and exit at this point. And as we can see on here, in our logging of this transaction, that the MasterCard for $14.90 was voided and the MasterCard was completed again for the new amount. Let's take a look at how we void out a transaction when a gift card was in use. I'm going to go ahead and choose to void order on this transaction for everything. Maybe this was done in error or we have a customer complaint, but regardless, I'll choose void order. All of the items have been removed from the transaction. They've been voided. And I do have change owing of $25.65. Again, choosing done and exit will return this as cash, but we do not wish to do this. I'll choose the gift card payment. And by clicking on it, I can now see that I have an option to void. Let's void. There is no remaining balance. This was returned back to the gift card. And I'll choose done and exit. Now, keeping in mind, these are Volante gift cards within the Volante customer database that we are looking at today. If you are voiding gift cards from a third-party provider, we will review that in a subsequent video. For this transaction, again, to a gift card, we're going to void out one of the items and make some modifications to our payments. We'll go through our process again of choosing reopen, modify table, and now we have a list of our items available. I'll choose the mini donuts and choose to do a void on that item while picking an item reason. I'll hit total and go back into my payment screen. My first step in this case is to choose my gift card and choose to do a void. Now the balance of $18.90 is owing again. The good thing about the Volante gift card in this scenario is if I choose gift card to apply the payment to, the gift card details are held on this transaction. So I can go ahead now and choose to apply, which will apply the revised balance, and we can see that no balance is owing. I'll choose done and exit, which puts me back to my transaction viewing screen, and we can see all the modifications and voids that took place within this transaction and the transaction logging. Throughout all of these voids we're doing today, just a reminder that receipts are being printed by default and can be kept or presented to the customer as proof of the voids. We'll take a look now at a few transactions involving some of our residents or our payroll deduct type customers. In this transaction, we can see that an on-account payment was made for $14.13 for this particular resident. I'll go ahead and just choose to do a void on the order for this and choose my reason code. We do have a notification that payments will need to be corrected, so I'll choose OK. We can see that the items are no longer in this transaction. I'll choose the account, I'll choose void, and we can see that the reversal has taken place. Done and exit puts us back to our screen. And looking at this transaction, we can see that a void of $14.13 took place. Taking a look again at a similar transaction, we have another option here on screen where we have multiple accounts that were billed. Maybe I'd like to go in and make a modification to only one of these items. Maybe something was entered in error. Let's go ahead and make some corrections. We'll go through the correct process of what to do when we're modifying some orders and either a single or multiple customer accounts are in play. Let's choose to reopen and modify our table. I'm going to go ahead and remove the crispy chicken wings. We'll do a void and pick our reason code, customer complaint. I'm going to hit total, and I'm going to go to my payment screen. In this case, I have multiple items that are tagged within my menu to bill differently depending on the item type to a different account. Some items were billed to the first account and some items were billed to the second account. This often comes into play when we have a mix of inclining and declining type accounts, where some items may be eligible for meal style plans, additional items may be eligible for alcohol type plans or extra charge plans. I'm going to reverse both charges. I'm going to hit void, and I'm going to hit void. I've reversed both charges as I do not know which particular items are billing to which accounts. I'll hit done and exit at this time, which is a little bit different than the last few examples. This takes me back to my main screen, and I'm going to choose my on account button. What happens in this case is the system knows to bill all applicable items to the first account, take any remaining items, bill them to the second account, and so on through all accounts that are available to this particular customer until there's none remaining or the remaining items are to be paid for in cash or additional payment types. I'll choose on account, and we can see by looking at this transaction that we voided out 1720 and we voided out 1375 from our account types. And we can see that they were rebilled for 1125 and 1375. So modifications to on accounts are best handled by voiding out all payments to all accounts that were done and then reapplying the payments afterwards to make sure that the routing of the items to the accounts is done correctly. I'm going to go ahead and choose exit at this point, and we'll take a look at a few other transactions that we can do and how we can modify from within a transaction window within Cashier. From my main POS screen, I'll swipe in my Cashier card and go into Cashier mode. I'm going to enter a customer into this transaction, which we can do either by swiping or fobbing or searching for them in our customer database. And I'm going to choose one of our customers with a meal count plan on their account type. In this case, 3 meals per day, and I'll choose OK. We can see that 3 meals per day are on this plan, and I'll choose a food item. In this case, a crispy chicken wrap. I'm going to hit total. And just so we can see how the processing happens, I'll go into my payments, and I'm going to go ahead and choose meal plan and select this. We can see that in the meal plan, the full amount, 100%, came off on eligible items, and there's no balance remaining. I'll hit done and exit. Now, within this POS setup, I do have a button on my secondary screen called Reopen Transaction and Reopen Last. These are handy buttons to have included on your POS layout, and if you wish to have these buttons added, please speak to the Volante support team for assistance. If I choose to reopen last, it will ask me for my manager override. I can swipe in my manager card or enter my manager number. As we can see, the eligible meal count has gone down from 3 to 2. I would like to reverse the charge on this item. This may have been an incorrect payment or an incorrect item add. I'll go into my total. I'm going to go into payment, and I'm going to choose meal plan, and I'm going to choose remove. This removes the meal plan application for this particular item. Well, I'll choose done and exit, void this particular item, continue my sale with an override. This has been removed, and now I'm going to total, and I'm going to close. There's nothing remaining on this. If I go back into my customer's account now and put them into a transaction, we can see that their eligible meals has gone up to 3. This is a correction that was done to return that meal back to this particular customer or resident, depending on our situation. If we add one of our residents into a transaction, again with a fob or any other means, we can see that this particular resident has a declining balance remaining in a positive amount, as well as an incline or charge account for extra charges going into a negative. Let's go through one transaction with this customer. I'll choose an appetizer, and I'll choose a main, and I'm going to choose some wine. So I'll choose a Merlot, and I'll choose a dessert. So let's go ahead and choose some donuts. When I hit total and on account, it will sort out the items as applicable to the specified accounts based on my menu tagging. So I'll choose my on account, which will hit all of my accounts with one click. Maybe I've made a mistake. Maybe I accidentally added the donuts and the wine into this transaction and I need to remove them. Using those two buttons we discussed, the reopen transaction or reopen last, I can go back into my transaction with a manager's override. I'm going to void out some of these items, in this case the donuts, with a manager override and a reason code. And the same thing, I'm going to void out the item with a reason code, and I'm going to total, and I'm going to go into my payment screen. At this time, 1044 is owing back to the customer. We do not want to return this back to the customer in cash. I'll void out my two payments that were made to the on accounts. I'm going to hit done and exit. As we know we have a positive balance, it's okay to do that as long as we have a positive amount owing, the transaction won't complete. I'll choose my on account button now, which will complete my transaction. If I resume this transaction again, we can see that I've removed the alcohol and some food items from the transaction. No amounts were owing. So when I hit total, we can see the payment history that's taken place on this transaction. Voids did take place on the two accounts. As well, we can see the rebilling of $13.39 to a single account. These are food items which were likely billed to that first single account, the declining account, and as there were no alcohol or extra charge style items available, the second account wasn't billed. This is why the on account button is very useful, as it will bill all accounts as needed with the appropriate item types. Let's go ahead and choose to close. One last button we can talk about is the reopen transaction button. By entering with my manager override, I can see all of the transactions that were run within the system, very similar to the transaction checker we used previously. I'll choose a reopen, enter my manager override a second time, and this particular transaction had been done with a gift card, but there were no items or balances. We'd voided everything within it. I'll choose total, and we'll close it out. Thank you for watching, and look for the next videos on processing refunds and creating customer satisfaction vouchers.